Chapter 10, Self-Adjustment or Instability. This chapter talks about the big debate. John Maynard Keynes challenged the classical assertion the economy would self-adjust. Keynes said that there would be no automatic self-adjustment. The economy could stagnate in persistent unemployment or have continuing inflation. This debate has continued since the 30s and is ongoing. That's what we're going to discuss here, is the Keynesian debate. Self-adjustment or intervention. We've been discussing it for the last couple of chapters. We're going to keep doing so here. And I'm going to add in some additional comments as we go. This chapter and this PowerPoint are really kind of geared more towards the Keynesian perspective and don't give the classical point of view on much of this. And I'm going to insert a few things here or there so we get both sides as we go. First thing we're going to talk about are leakages. These are leakages out of the economy. You can see the circular flow there from the product market to the business firms to the factor market to the households. Sales revenue circles all the way around to consumption. And in the leakages, this is when money leaks out of the business cycle. These are inefficiencies. Savings, imports, household taxes, and business savings. When these things happen, we pull money out of the economy. So we usually don't think of that. Whenever we save more, that is a leakage out of the economy. I'm not discussing the ethical or moral implications of that, but we're talking about the fact of the matter is that whenever we save, that's money that's pulled out of the GDP. So when we saw savings go from none to 10% at the start of the Great Recession, that was 10% out of the GDP. So that's just an example of leakages, and these are the other leakages. Of course, taxes are leakages as well. We would be spending lots more money if we didn't pay taxes. I mean, think about it. How much more money you would probably be spending if you didn't have to pay taxes. So that money goes to the government to then re-spend to try and stimulate the economy. But if we didn't pay those taxes in the first place, would the economy need stimulating? Remember that most of government spending goes towards redistribution, taking from one person to give to another. Medicare, Social Security, food stamps, unemployment, all those things together make up well over 50% of all government spending. Would those things be necessary? Some probably would. Some, I say most definitely would, but you probably wouldn't need to spend nearly as much as if we had lower taxes or no taxes and relied on other sources of income for the government. So those are two different perspectives on leakages and how the government interacts with taxes and so forth. And we'll get more into taxes in another chapter. Injections. This is where government injects money back into the economy. This is in the way of exports, government spending, and investment. Well, I should say the government injects through government spending. Exports and investment come from the market and not from the government. Self-adjustment. Classical economists assume that leakages always equaled injections. For example, they use the flexible interest rates as the mechanism to ensure this. If saving, which is a leakage, exceeds investment, injection, available funds to borrow increase and interest rates fall, which spurs more investment borrowing. But once again, we don't really have flexible interest rates because the Federal Reserve sets the interest rates. And we've talked about the Federal Reserve a little so far. We're going to talk about it a bunch more in the future, but we don't have flexible interest rates. So we don't know if it would work this way or not. If investment, the last point, if investment or injection exceeds savings, then available funds to borrow decrease and interest rates rise, which inhibits investment borrowing. Once again, this has to be done by the chairman of the Fed and the Federal Reserve Board, and is not done by the market. And many times the Fed will ignore the market in order to try and further stimulate the economy or slow the economy down, even though the market may not dictate that higher rates are necessary. So once again, we have people doing this instead of the market doing it. So we don't know if this would really work or not in our current economy. Keynes' response to self-adjustment. Changing expectations. As savings increases, consumption decreases and GDP falls. So the business outlook is gloomy. Business investment spending would more likely fall rather than rise. So let's look at that again. So as savings increases, consumption decreases because you're saving more and spending less, and GDP falls, which it would, business outlook isn't good. So business investment would most likely fall rather than rise. The classical theory says that business investment would increase. So if people are saving more, are they more likely to use that savings towards investing in business, or are they more likely to just sit on their savings? That's what the fundamental argument here is between the Keynesian and classical approaches to economics. The reality is sometimes they probably wouldn't spend it, and sometimes they probably would invest it. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. I don't think a blanket answer. There's no evidence that a one-size-fits-all answer would apply here. Self-adjustment continued. Classical economists say that any rising inventory of goods would trigger falling prices. This is important. Any rising inventory of goods would trigger falling prices. This would lead to increased selling to reduce the undesired inventory. The increased selling would shift aggregate demand to the right. Lower prices shifts aggregate demand to the right toward the GDP needed at the full employment level. So the classical economists feel that if something were overproduced, what would be a good example of something that would be overproduced? If a certain book were to be overproduced, overprinted, that the price of that book, when it stopped selling, the price would be dropped to eliminate the inventory, and the dropping of the price would continue to stimulate purchasing, buying, and increase the GDP. Airline prices, hotel prices, now with the internet, they take advantage of this all the time with a service like Priceline, where Priceline will sell those hotel rooms that are still available at the last minute. So a few days out, you can get a very good rate because the hotel would rather have you stay in a $300 room for $100 a night or $50 a night rather than let it go empty. That's an example of self-adjustment, the classical self-adjustment. In the hotel, the classical economists feel that the hotel is benefiting by getting something rather than nothing for that inventory. Keynes's response, the Keynesian response to self-adjustment, changing expectations. More would be bought at lower prices, more books, more hotel rooms, but as prices fall, profits diminish, and businesses will further reduce production and eliminate investment plans. They would produce no more until the undesired inventory is sold. This leads to yet more layoffs to equilibrium at high unemployment. Now, what Keynes is essentially saying is that yes, more would be brought at lower prices, but ultimately that's going to lead to the business's decline by selling at a lower price. And in this particular case, it's a difficult argument he's making because, for example, the hotel example, to take something rather than nothing for a product is just makes more financial sense, and that's why they do it. Businesses do what works, not what the theory says. And businesses always will eventually take will take less money to unload a product. So that's what they do. If it didn't make sense to do that, they wouldn't do it because they're not driven by economic theory. Another example are cars. All new cars that are produced are eventually sold. Just a matter of for what. That's why you can go on a used car lot in 2013 and find 2011 models marked way down. They're going to keep those on the lots or move them to other lots until they eventually sell. And they're going to drop that price low enough until someone actually buys it. So that's how people really practice. So it doesn't seem that Keynes' theory in this particular case is ever really put into practice. And companies aren't necessarily hurt by delaying selling a product and keeping the prices low and slowly lowering the price until the product is sold. Rather than adjusting back towards full employment, Keynes saw the economy becoming more unstable as businesses react to declining sales, falling prices, and lowered expectations of the future. So Keynes believes that once a business starts, businesses as a whole, I should say, start accepting lower prices for selling their product at lower prices, that they will eventually start to spiral in a negative way. People will be laid off. They will not be reinvesting back into their business, and it will just start us in a deflationary cycle. The effect on household income. So reduced production means layoffs. So he believes that lower prices automatically means reduced production. That's a big jump. Lower prices it typically do mean reduced production, but is it temporary or is it long term? If Ford has trouble selling one of their cars one year, a pickup truck one year, sales are a little bit down, they have to drop prices. Are they going to drop production by a lot the next year? Are they going to keep production high, or create new efficiencies in production, or try to create new efficiencies with their labor force, maybe a little more streamlining? In that case, some people may be laid off, but they're probably going to try and make their business more efficient to save costs, to adjust to the new lower price level. And that's what companies usually do, rather than, oh, we can't get our same money for the car anymore, so we're just going to have to fire everybody. Businesses don't typically work that way. They try to create efficiencies through innovation, create new products, reinvest back into their companies. Businesses want to survive. People that run businesses want to make money and survive and push forward. They don't want to close up shop and go hide and wait for things to get better, which is kind of what Keynes believes, that all people will react in the exact same manner, and that the natural human response, the entrepreneurial response to trouble, is to push forward. Okay, this product didn't sell. How can we make next year's product so good, next year's pickup truck so good that no one can resist? That people have to buy it because it's got so many new great features and so much more power. This is why cars get more powerful and safer and more fuel efficient as time goes on, because that's what the consumer demands. And in order to keep selling, they have to keep making the product better. And that's the reality of the market. Keynes, in this particular area, his theory really struggles to hold true for most products. Continuing on with the bullet points here, reduced income means less spending, and aggregate demand shifts further to the left away from full employment. And this is what he saw, and much of his theory came from the Great Depression. This is what he saw during the Great Depression, is deflation. And that's essentially what he's talking about here, is deflation. Prices fall, people are laid off, and they can't afford as much since they don't have any money, so prices continue to fall, and you end up in this deflationary cycle. And that results in more unemployment and less spending, and once again you get this deflationary cycle. A relatively small problem could snowball into a much larger. The multiplier process. If you let the investment decline, this leaves unsold output. Production is cut back, income decreases, consumer spending decreases, and then it cycles again. Once again, that's the deflationary cycle. The eventual decrease in spending will be much larger than the initial decline in spending. The eventual shift of the aggregate demand curve to the left will be much larger than the initial shift to the left. Now, he is right that a deflationary cycle can occur. The question, once again, is that it's a bit of a chicken or egg scenario. What starts the deflationary cycle? Is it consumers' unwillingness to spend or inability to spend? And that's one thing that's not discussed a lot in the Keynes theory. Unwillingness to spend versus inability to spend. The Great Recession, which we've just come out of, or some would argue we've come out of it, we're kind of still in it in some ways here in 2013. In the Great Recession, we chose not to spend as a society. We didn't have, it was an unwillingness to spend, rather than we were forced to stop spending. So initially it was an unwillingness to spend. And then it became, and then this deflationary cycle started to kick in a little bit, and then it became an inability to spend, as many people were laid off and did lose their jobs, and spending reductions had to take place. Now, what could have been done to prevent it from going from unwillingness to inability? Because what Keynes is talking about is what to do once people reach the inability stage. And what could have been done, or what caused us to go from the unwillingness to spend to the inability to spend. And looking back at 2001 with 9/11 and what happened right after that. During 9/11, right after 9/11, you probably remember George Bush telling everybody to go shopping, because he knew that if we could end up in a deflationary cycle, if people stop spending, even for a couple months, some people get laid off, they can't spend, and next thing you know, that deflationary cycle is off and running. So he knew that if we spent, that was good. And so he did everything in his power to encourage spending right from the start, and told us we have to keep spending as usual. We have to, in order to avoid this problem. Fast forward to 2008, 2009. We were told of all these problems, but consumer confidence was key in 2001, and we overcame it. And in 2008, 2009, we didn't overcome it very well at the start. The president came out, the same president, Bush, came out in a panicked speech and said that the economy was on the verge of collapse, and 99.9% of the people out there didn't, or maybe not that high, but a large percentage didn't know what he was talking about, because there was no recession yet. People were still spending as usual. The problems were in the banking system, and I discussed this in the video you guys saw at the beginning of class. Problems were in the banking system, not with the average consumer. And it was a big mistake to go scare the entire country into into not spending anymore, and scaring them this way. And then the media jumped on and scared people even further. I would argue that the Great Recession would never have happened if nobody knew about the banking problems. Yes, a lot of people would have been foreclosed on, and yes, a lot of banks would have been in trouble. But it was all they were bailed out, and everything returned to normal. If the people didn't know about it, we probably would have not had any recession. We wouldn't have even known it happened. Now, then there's the whole freedom of the press issue. I'm not going to get into that. We're just talking pure economic theory and why things happen. I'm not saying people shouldn't have been told. Just saying from an economic theory perspective, it's an interesting thought exercise. The Keynesian adjustment process. Producers cut output on an unemployment when output exceeds aggregate demand at the current price level. The resulting loss of income causes a consumer spending decline. This leads to further production cutbacks, more job loss, lost income, and still less consumption. The aggregate demand shifts further to the left as the multiplier process goes into effect. So let's look again at what exactly is going on here. Producers cut output and unemployment when output exceeds the demand. So when consumers are making more than they can sell, they cut demand, and once again, the loss of income spirals into a deflationary cycle. He's talking on a macro level, all producers together. So he's talking essentially about an increase in aggregate demand, even though it seems like he might be talking about an individual company. And like we talked about earlier, he really discounts the ability of the marketplace to adjust to consumer wants and needs. It really takes, at this point, some sort of outside trigger to convince people to stop spending. And like we had in the Great Recession, or we had at 9/11 with the little blip, or that we had at various times with the oil crisis back in the 70s, where there's a trigger that gets people to stop spending. They don't just decide to stop all at once for no reason. Because of that, as long as producers continue to innovate and continue to produce better products and continue to make things better and more desirable, the economy moves forward, and Keynesian adjustment does not appear to be necessary. And what we've done in this country recently is just enter into a state of constant Keynesian adjustment, constant government spending and government money printing, throwing money into the economy, because that's Keynes's answer to these problems, which you've probably been waiting for. Because what does Keynes suggest we do? Print more money, print more money, print more money, government spend to keep aggregate demand high. And because we've been in a constant state of that, we don't really know if the classical approach would even work anymore, because we've been printing money at the 7% rate since World War II, or just after World War II. And because we've been printing so much money, and I should say average of 7% from like World War II to 2008, since then it's gone much, much, much higher than 7%. Much, much higher than 7%. So we don't really know how the classical approach would work now, and if it would create even more growth than the Keynesian approach, because remember, the Keynesian approach believes, and Keynes believes, that printing money creates growth, infusing money creates growth, but it also causes a weakened currency, which, as we discussed earlier, also causes problems and slows the economy down. The multiplier process, we're just continuing from the last slide now. The multiplier process, once again, it just continues that deflationary cycle. Booms and busts. Keynesian analysis concluded that the economy is vulnerable to abrupt changes in spending behavior and won't self-adjust to a desired macro equilibrium. Changing in expectations for both consumers and businesses adjust their market activities, which could lead to a worsening condition. Abrupt shifts of aggregate demand cause the reoccurring business cycles, resulting in a series of booms and busts. That's absolutely correct. That we do go through booms and busts, and whether you're classical or Keynesian, those booms and busts will happen. And as I talked about in the previous chapter, the more the government gets involved, the more muted, the less severe the bust can become. But we're also going to end up muting the booms. So it's just really risk tolerance. Those that are don't have much tolerance for risk tend to be Keynesian, because they don't want to. They're willing to take a little sacrifice in the size of the boom. They're going to sacrifice the size of the boom to prevent the big bust. Where those that are less risk averse are more likely to be classical economists, and they're going to be far more interested in it. Yeah, we'll take the big bust for the huge boom. And ultimately, everybody will be better off, because the economy and the GDP will be in a higher place, even though we're going to have to go through some of those busts. And that seems to hold pretty true. All right, we'll be back with you for the next chapter.